she's just running through the woods trying to get away from whoever this was. This guy's just waiting for me to stop, and then he's gonna attack me.
I am here to tell you a story that will torture your thoughts by day and poison your dreams by night.
The emptiness will haunt you.
In 1989, 22-year-old Eloise Lindsay was on the brink of her life. She had just finished her college degree and she was really excited to get out of school and to move on with the next chapter of her life. But Eloise had a problem. She hadn't put a whole lot of thought into where she wanted to live or specifically what job she wanted to get. But because Lindsay was so into the outdoors and she was really into hiking, into mountain climbing, into camping, what Eloise thought that she needed to do would just be to get out of the city, get out into the mountains, and go on a backpacking trip to kind of clear her mind and to reflect on herself before making any big decisions about what she wanted to do with her life. Eloise had always loved hiking through the mountains. It was the one place where she felt true serenity, and it was just so peaceful out in the mountains that she always liked to get out into the mountains before she would make any big life decisions like the one that was ahead of her now. And so, Eloise took some time and she carefully mapped out a plan to take this 43-mile hike along the Appalachian Trail. The Appalachian Trail is a very popular 2,000-mile hiking trail that runs along the Appalachian Mountains from Maine all the way to northern Georgia. And so this particular section of the Appalachian Trail, which Eloise was planning on hiking on, only represented a very small portion of the entirety of that trail. So in 1989, Eloise packed her bags and she told her parents that she was heading out on this backpacking trip and that she would be back around November 4th. And her parents knew that Eloise was a super experienced hiker and backpacker and she had done stuff like this before, so they weren't worried at all. They just said, okay, have a great time, we'll see you when you get back. And so Eloise hopped in her car and she made her way up to the starting point of this mountain where she was going to begin her hike. And Eloise had a plan that she would hike for the first 7 days. She was going to be hiking all by herself. She was going to go up onto the trail and she was going to hike by herself for the first section. And then at about the 7-day mark, she was going to meet a friend of hers at a rendezvous point that they had agreed on before. And then they were going to finish the hike together. This friend of hers wanted to go with her for the whole trip, but she couldn't get away from work and from school for the entirety of that whole time that Eloise was planning on hiking. So Eloise just said, it's no problem, just do whatever you can. I'll hike the first part of it by myself, and then you can meet up with me at the end and we can finish the hike together. And so it was with high spirits that Eloise began her hike on the Appalachian Trail. And for the first few days of Eloise's hike, everything went perfectly. She was in these beautiful mountains surrounded by nature, and she had plenty of time to think introspectively and to think about what she wanted to do with her life. This really was Eloise's happy place. Ever since she was a little girl, she had always loved nature and getting out on hikes like this. So after the busyness of college and the stress of these upcoming life decisions, it was really nice for Eloise to just get away and to be in nature like this. But unfortunately for Eloise, this feeling of euphoria didn't last long, because only at about the 2nd day of her hike, as she was hiking up into this mountain, she would look off into the trees at a certain point in the trail. She would look off into the trees and she could have swore she saw a man staring at her through the trees. And this guy was a long way off in the distance and she couldn't really make him out. And so Eloise kind of did a double take and she's looking through the trees, but when she looks again, the man's nowhere to be found. She doesn't see him anymore. But she could have sworn that she saw somebody looking in her direction. And when she was looking at him, it looked like he was kind of moving and trying not to be seen, but clearly was looking at her. And this kind of weirded Eloise out. Like, of course she was on the Appalachian Trail, so it wouldn't be totally impossible for her to come across somebody also hiking on the trail. But because this trail is such a long trail, it's over 2,000 miles long, it's not uncommon for people to hike for days on the Appalachian Trail and never run across anybody. And so it was not particularly weird to see somebody, but it did seem weird that this guy was clearly not on the trail. He was like way off into the trees looking down at the trail. And then when Eloise looked back and looked around and called out, she didn't hear anything and she didn't see anybody. And so she was like, maybe I imagined it, or maybe it was an animal. And she kind of goes on her way and kind of tries to convince herself that she didn't actually see somebody. Maybe it was in her imagination, or maybe it wasn't exactly what she saw. And so trying to put it out of her mind, Eloise kept on walking down this trail. But for some reason, after she saw that man, as she kept on walking, she started to get this strange feeling of dread, almost as if somebody was watching her. And she kept on looking around and she couldn't see anybody, But as she walked for the next few hours, she couldn't stop herself from constantly looking over her shoulder and looking back and looking around, because she had just that weird feeling that you sometimes get when you clearly feel that you're not alone. Eloise had this deep feeling of dread, like somebody was watching her. And so, as this feeling of dread begins to build in Eloise, she keeps looking around and she's not seeing anybody. But Eloise found herself walking a little bit faster, and then she was walking a little bit faster and a little bit faster, trying to just get away from this feeling. Like maybe he was like in this part of the woods and was kind of like watching her, until eventually this feeling got so overwhelming that Eloise actually began to run. She was like running at like a light jog for a good distance until she was miles away from that place where she had first seen this guy. But no matter how fast she went or how far she got away from where she had first seen this guy, she could not shake this feeling of dread. And then Eloise began to notice that she was hearing sounds in the woods, almost like somebody was following her. And at first, she was hearing these sounds and she would attribute it to just animals off in the distance. Like, this is a forest, right? So it's not uncommon to have deer and animals in the forest. So when she would hear a stick break or the bushes rustle, she wouldn't think much of it. But as she's feeling this feeling that she's being watched, coupling that with these sounds of footsteps, and so as she starts to pay attention to the sound of footsteps, it becomes more and more clear to her that these footsteps are stopping when she's stopping, and then they would begin again as she would start walking again. And so this just added to that horrible feeling, like somebody was in the woods just out of sight and was stalking her as she walked along the Appalachian Trail. And so Eloise was in this kind of awkward situation where she had no idea really what to do, right? This was before the time of cell phones, right? This is 1989. So she couldn't call anybody. She couldn't do anything. And she was miles away from the trailhead where she had parked her car and where she had started this hike, because this is like the second day of her hike. But she was also miles away from the rendezvous point where she was supposed to meet her friend, because she was supposed to meet her friend on day 7. She was days away from that. So Eloise is kind of in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the wilderness, and she's got this guy stalking her, but she doesn't really know what to do. And so Eloise knows, like, okay, if I go to the rendezvous point, it's going to take me, even if I just run and hike through all night, maybe I could get there in like a day. But she couldn't stand the idea of walking down this trail with that guy in the woods kind of stalking the trail and watching her go down it. But the only other option was to go off of the trail and try to take a shortcut. And Eloise was almost certain that there was a paved road for cars that was following the trail that was down below her. So if she walked off the trail and headed straight down the mountain far enough, she would eventually come to this road where maybe she could catch a ride to the rendezvous point, or at least she would be around civilization, so that there would be less of a chance of whoever this was in the woods, there'd be less of a chance of him being able to get after her. And so that's what Eloise did. She makes the decision that she's going to leave the trail and she's going to start heading downhill, hoping that she comes to this road. So she diverts off the path and she begins walking through the woods, hoping to get away from this guy. So she starts picking up her pace a little bit, and as she's going, to her absolute horror, whoever this was behind her started to come down. He must have come down and crossed the trail where she had just been, and now he was following her because she's going straight down, and she hears the sounds of these footsteps behind her, but every time she would look over her shoulder, she wouldn't see anybody, and whenever she would stop, the footprints would stop too, and she would just be left with this horrible feeling of dread that somebody was watching her. And so over the next few hours, Eloise begins to pick up her pace until eventually she's just running through the woods trying to get away from whoever this was. But it seemed like no matter what she did, no matter how fast she ran, whoever was chasing her was keeping up with her no problem, and he was stopping when she was stopping and moving with her as she would move. And now, in addition to the footsteps, Eloise started to hear a low grunting sound. Like when she would stop and she would listen, she started to hear like heavy breathing and a low grunting sound that almost sounded human, but also almost sounded kind of animal-like. And so at this point, Eloise was totally convinced there was somebody in these woods and he was following her. And with nothing else to do, Eloise just kept on walking down this hill. She just kept on walking straight. But apparently, she had gotten it wrong. She never came to a road. Either she was wrong and there was no road beneath her, or this road was significantly further away than she expected, because she expected to get to the road in just a little bit of time. But after hours of hiking through the woods, she never came to it, and now she's alone, She's miles off of the trail. It's completely pitch black at this point, right? The sun had gone down. It's completely dark. She's all alone. And whenever she stops, she hears this guy in the woods. And every time she's moving, she hears the sound of him following her. And she's just standing there with this horrible feeling of dread, like this guy's just waiting for me to stop, and then he's gonna attack me. But at this point, Eloise had no choice, and she had to take her chances. So Eloise would just stop, and she would kind of look around, and she wouldn't see anybody. And so she would take out her backpack, and she would set up her tent, and she had to try to get a few hours sleep, or at least, had to stop for the night. And her hope was that maybe she could get through the night, and then she'll find the trail or she'll find the road in the morning. And so she sets up her tent and she lies inside. And as she's lying down asleep in her tent, she's just lying awake, and she hears the sound of whoever this is, and he starts to make circles around her campsite, right? He's staying back probably about 30 yards or so, right? It's not like he's walking right up to her tent. But as she's laying there in her tent, she can hear the sound of whoever this is walking around her campsite. And so Eloise lays awake for what seems like hours, but I guess eventually she would fall asleep because she kind of woke up a couple hours later and the sun was just coming up. And so Eloise packed up, she rolled up her sleeping bag, she packed up her tent, packed up all of her gear really quickly, and then she began to quickly hike through the woods, hoping like, okay, today I'm going to find the road, or I'm going to get back to the trail. Today's the day I'm getting out of here. But all the way through this next day, Eloise went through the exact same experience. She was hearing this guy following her. She still had this feeling like she was being watched. And all day she was determined to get to the road, to get to civilization, to get out of these woods. And that's what Eloise does. She tries to get out of the woods. But eventually the entire day goes by, and once again the sun starts to go down. And at this point, Eloise is completely lost. She doesn't even know where to go. She doesn't know if she should go up, down, left, right. She just knows she's in the same position as she was last night. The sun is down, it's now completely dark, and she had to make camp and spend another restless night with this guy walking around her campsite once again. And then the next day, Eloise would get up and she would pack up her gear, and then this was the day she was going to make it to civilization. She was going to get out of here. And she walks around, and the same thing happens again. And she's forced to spend yet another night alone in the woods. And this went on not for 2 days, not for 3 days. This went on for weeks, as Eloise every day would get up and try to get out of here, try to get out of the woods, try to get unlost. But every day she would hike all day, and then the sun would go down and she would have to spend another night. And throughout this entire time, Eloise has this sinister feeling that whoever's following her in the woods is not only totally committed to chasing her, because he never stops. She never stops hearing these footsteps. She never stops hearing these grunting sounds and these low, deep breathing sounds. And she never shakes this ominous feeling that no matter where she is, somebody's just behind a tree looking at her and watching her every move. And at one point, whoever was following her began to give her such a bad feeling and started to get so close to her that Eloise took off running as fast as she possibly could through the woods. And she's breaking through branches and she's just running at full speed. But still, she feels this guy catching up to her. And so Eloise is so terrified that she takes off her backpack, which had her tent, her clothing, all of her gear, everything. She drops it on the ground and she just keeps on running, just so she can run fast enough to get away from this guy. Like, that's how scared she was. She knew he was right on her, so she had to get rid of all of her loose weight to get away and stop whoever this was from catching her. But of course, this led to a whole new catastrophe, because when she stopped running, whoever it was didn't come after and attack her. But now she was alone in the woods, and now she had no gear. She had no equipment, she had no food, and so Eloise just has to spend the night curled up on the ground, hoping whoever this was, once again, doesn't come after her. And after a few days of not having any supplies and not eating any food, Eloise is starting to get very weak, which is obviously not surprising. Like, she's been out in the woods for a couple of weeks. It's now been a few days since she's eaten, and so she's starting to get kind of delirious and kind of wandering through the woods, not really knowing what to do. And then by some miracle, Eloise stumbles upon just a pile of donuts and pound cake. Just randomly in the woods. It was like some hiker or trapper or hunter had left donuts and pound cake in the middle of the woods. This could have been a hunter's trick to attract animals, because sometimes people who are hunting animals will leave out sweets to attract animals so that they can shoot them, which is against the law, but I know that's something that people do. But anyway, she finds these donuts and pound cake, and so she quickly grabs up as much as she can, and she starts carrying them, and she's actually lucky to find a natural creek that's running down the mountain. And so she sits down, and she is actually able to survive for a few days eating these donuts and pound cake, and that's what kept her alive for a little bit more. But eventually, all her food was gone once again, and Eloise had lost track of time. She had been alone in these woods for she doesn't know how long, and still Eloise would hear the footsteps of the man following her, and she would still hear the grunts and the sounds coming from the woods, and she never shook the feeling of this guy watching her. And she started to realize that this was probably what he wanted. He was probably watching her to see how far she was willing to go and how much she could take being stalked through these woods, and he was probably just waiting for her to eventually collapse onto the ground, and then at that point he was probably going to come after her. And sure enough, at a certain point, as Eloise is kind of just crawling her way through the woods, she would eventually just lay down by a log, and she would just kind of give herself up and just think she had no more strength left, and if this guy was going to come after her, this would be the time to do it. And sure enough, eventually she kind of doesn't really know how much time is passing because she's so delirious and she's not really all there. But sure enough, at a certain point, as she's laying by this log, she sees a man come out of the woods and come up to her. So with the last bit of strength that she has, Eloise tries to get away, and she screams and she cries and she says, no, please don't kill me. This man would explain like, no, I'm not here to hurt you. And he would actually pick Eloise up and he would take her down to a hospital. The man who eventually did find Eloise laying by that log was not the person who had been stalking her. He was just a random hunter who had been hiking through the woods hunting, when he would randomly come across this woman and he would see her laying by this log and think that she needed help. And so he would come and he would be her savior. And when Eloise's family had found out that she was in the hospital, they were completely shocked because, of course, there had been a massive search for Eloise this entire time. Because, of course, as Eloise was going through, she was supposed to meet her friend at that rendezvous. So when her friend went to the rendezvous and sat there waiting for Eloise, and when Eloise never showed up, her friend would actually go back to town and file a missing persons report. And so for weeks on this mountain, there was a massive search party consisting of police officers and volunteers, all of them looking for Eloise, but they never found her. And after 14 days of searching, Eloise had been missing for something like 20 days, and eventually the police called off the search, and they just assumed that this girl had gone missing and they were never going to find her. And it was actually 2 days later, 2 days after the search had been called off and everyone had pretty much given Eloise up for lost, like assumed that she was never coming back. 2 days after that, this hunter would randomly come across Eloise and she would be saved. To this day, we actually don't know who was stalking Eloise. Some people have theorized that nobody was stalking her, and that maybe Eloise had just had a mental break when she was in the woods. Maybe due to all the stress she was under and then being out in the woods alone, maybe her brain had just snapped and she had imagined all of it. But this does seem like an unlikely thing to happen, not only because it's so rare, but also because Eloise had done things like this before. Going backpacking and hiking in nature was more like her happy place. This didn't seem like something that would cause her to have a mental breakdown, but I guess it's a possibility. Other people have speculated that she actually was hunted by wild men, who are, as their name implies, wild men who are just kind of feral, living up on the mountains around the Appalachian Trail. Supposedly these guys are completely off the grid, they live off of the land, and they don't have any interaction with society whatsoever. It's possible that one of these men, who might have lived on that mountain for his entire life, just saw this girl walking by herself and just kind of took an interest and just decided that he was going to follow her for as long as he wanted to, and that ended up being close to 22 days. But whatever it was, mental breakdown or actually being stalked by somebody in the woods, we know that this experience was terrifying for Eloise. Just the fact that she threw off her backpack and ran as fast as she could, ditching all of her gear, is one thing that shows to me that she truly was terrified, because everyone knows, especially anybody who's experienced living in the wild, knows that leaving your gear is literally the last thing you want to do. Thank you for watching this video. Go down in the comments right now and tell me what you think the ugliest dog in the world is. Also, like this video if you believe in human rights, and share it with that one friend who's dumb enough to go hiking in the woods by themselves. Which is of course something that you should never do, and is something that I definitely did not do myself last week. Anyway, thank you for watching, and please consider subscribing, because if you don't subscribe, you never know when I might burn out and just never upload another video. You never know. This right here, this could be it. But of course, it's probably not. I hope to see you again. We'll see. Anyway, thank you for watching. I'll see you next time, but until then, be safe out there.